Welcome to the PACTS conference on changing behaviour, reducing road risk. I'm Jamie Hassall, the Executive Director. We've got four sessions today and a panel session at the end. And there'll be sort of short Q&As after each session, and then a sort of larger panels Q&A at the end. So if I can ask you to use the Q&A function to do that. The chat function is operational, but it's not necessarily being sort of routinely monitored. So don't put your questions in there. There's no fire alarms planned today, but I do have a small dog who might raise the odd alarm, especially sees a squirrel in the garden or something like that. So I do apologise if that happens. I want us today to think about what are the tools and techniques we have for changing behaviour, but also whose behaviour we need to change. What are those behaviours we need to change? What new behaviours do we want people to do? And yeah, thinking about how we work together to get the best results and most impact. So the government strategy should be coming out. We've sort of heard rumours it will be sort of early December. So hopefully that will be coming soon. And it's, yeah, if we can have a focused think about how we all work together, how we can have that impact on this important area. So I'd like to introduce Mark Cartwright from National Highways. They're our main sponsor for this event. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jamie. Good morning, everybody. One of the advantages, I guess, of being the primary sponsor of the event today is we can grab a few minutes in the introduction to peddle our wares a little bit, so do forgive me. Introduction, you can see on the screen, Mark Cartwright. I'm the team leader for the Commercial Vehicle Incident Prevention team at National Highways, and I'm also the SRO for our Driving for Better Business engagement programme. So if you're aware of DFBB, Driving for Better Business, fantastic. If you're not, please go and have a look at our website. There's loads of good stuff on there. Bear in mind the theme of today's conference around changing behaviours. The KPI that my team are judged on at the end of each year is the number of people that manage to die on our roads as a result of incidents involving commercial vehicles, or at-work drivers to be more correct. One of the things that we're very conscious of is clearly our plan A is to stop the crashes happening in the first place, but it'd be good to have a more cohesive plan B, i.e. the crashes have happened, how do we keep the victims alive after those crashes? So we've got a lot of work going on with Euro NCAP about vehicle standards and all kinds of interventions, but one of them in particular which we're very excited about, and this is really a bit of a sneak preview of this, you'll see some stuff coming out from us early in the new year on this, is around how we keep people alive after a crash long enough for a paramedic to get there who actually knows what they're doing. There are some various stats around the place, but it looks like around 25 to 30% of pre-hospital deaths at the scene of an incident could be presented by some fairly basic but timely bystander intervention. And that will translate to maybe 100, 200 lives a year potentially to be saved. So it's well worth looking at. And our ambition is to try and encourage and empower as many people on our roads as we can do to effectively be confident at behaving as in the first responder role. We took the view of this that to try and keep it into at least a degree of manageable proportions, that we would focus on the van driver community to start with, partly because there's a lot of them. There's 5.3 million vans on UK roads, but also through the work of Driving for Better Business, we've got some good links with some of the big fleets in there who are very keen to be involved and to be supporting on this. And what are we actually looking at doing? And our long-term ambition is worth saying is, you know, start with van drivers, but actually we're very interested in anybody that's using our roads for whatever purpose, whether it's at work or whether not at work, to maybe have access to these kind of information that we're developing at the moment. We're looking at three core competencies within this project. So number one, if you come across the scene of an incident, you're able to make the best 999 call anybody's ever made. You know where you are, you know what you're looking at, so the emergency service can dispatch the right stuff to the right place first time, cut down response times. a good 50% of the calls that come into blue light call centres, and indeed our own call centres, people really haven't got much of an idea of where they actually are, which slows things down quite a lot. So there's some very good, straightforward stuff that can be done there, which we'll be sharing early in the new year. Competency 2, and let me just really reinforce, we're not trying to encourage or coerce anybody into doing anything that they're not particularly comfortable with doing, but if they're the kind of individual that is likely to try and stay around the scene to try and help, their first priority has absolutely got to be to keep themselves safe. How they position their vehicles to do that, how they position their vehicles to keep out the way of other traffic, how they avoid positioning their vehicles to cause collisions, how they position their vehicles to allow access to the blue lights. And what we're very confident of is we've got about 500 people working at National Highways who are very, very good at that kind of stuff. They're our traffic officers. So we're learning from them to put this into kind of an approach where people can easily assimilate, the best practice to do in terms of scene management if they're at the scene of an incident. And the final bit, and this is a bit that most people seem to get quite excited about, for want of a better phrase, is the first aid piece. It's around triage. Any of you who've done first aid training will know that it's the quiet ones you need to look out for. If somebody's screaming off the top of their lungs, they might be in terrible pain, but they're fairly unlikely to die in the 12-15 minutes it's take the target time for a paramedic to arrive on scenes. Has there been anybody thrown from the vehicle? Is anybody missing? Has somebody wandered off in shock? It's all that kind of stuff. And then we're engaged very much with the paramedic community on this side of things via a very, very clever chap by the name of Professor Tim Nutbeam, as some of you might know. And Tim's very keen on directing the activity in here to 3 particular medical scenarios, dealing with cardiac issues, blocked airways and bleed control. And bleed outs are by some margin the biggest cause of deaths before paramedics arrive. So forgive me for being a bit blunt about this. The whole aim of this project is to give the paramedics something to work with when they actually arrive at the scene of the incident. How are we going to do this? We will create a series of micro-learning courses with verified completion certificates online. They'll be up online, as I say, fairly early on in the new year. We will also be ensuring that our materials are absolutely free, as are all Driving for Better Business and National Highways resources are absolutely free to anybody that wants to use them. I mentioned Professor Tim. This is absolutely the right kind of information to be providing and sharing. It's been validated by the medics. And the Impact project, which is something Tim Nutbeam is leading, will also be creating a companion app to go along with this, so that, to be blunt again, you could have done all the training in the world, but there's every chance your brain's going to turn to mush when you come to the scene of an incident. So if all that you remember to do is to fire up the app, it will step you through the processes. How do you make the best 999 call? How do you know where you are, with links to the What 3 Words app? How do you describe the scene? So there'll be links to the Good Sam app, which can link your video on your phone to the emergency services. It'll step you through the scene protection and protection of yourself element that we've spoken about, and it will also step you through the first aid processes and the triage process if you get there. So it's going to be a very complete set of resources, all available free. And this bullet point here about industry templates, sorry, I'm reading off a script which I'm talking to about bullet points which you can't see. Our intention isn't, we'll put this material out FOC. And I know this might sound like a very odd way of describing it, but we're very comfortable with it being a minimum viable product. If you want to do more, fantastic. And we will be providing templates for other organisations who want to develop their own training alongside this, their own apps alongside this, if they feel that that's appropriate to do. And if it meets or exceeds our materials, we'll recognise it for what it's worth. So there's hopefully quite a piece of work we can get going on here, and almost try and get it going viral, if that makes any sense. So clearly plan A, reduce collisions. Plan B, increase survivability, accelerate the response to collisions by the emergency services. I've trained bystanders out there able to act as crucial first responders, and we've got the support of DFT, industry and various providers. So thanks for the opportunity to make a quick trailer for that, Jamie, a quick tease on that. If anybody's interested in knowing more, wants to be involved with us in terms of doing some beta testing, all that kind of stuff, please drop me a note. at mark.cartwright@nationalhighways.co.uk, and we're very happy to help. Have your
Thanks,
conference back, Jamie.
I'm just going to ask you a quick question, actually. So, as I understand it, new drivers now have some first aid training as part of the theory test. That's right, isn't it? Or is that being introduced?
I don't think it's there yet. I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I'm not sure it's there yet. But I mean, our ambitions on this are significant, and as I say, we are involved with DFT on this, and actually part of the aim of this is to almost up the game a little bit in that kind of area. And we're very clear right the way through this programme this is about trying to keep victims alive long enough for the paramedic to work on them when they arrive.
I would go further because most of us, if we're in an office, there's some kind of fire alarm test and things like that. But we know that the fire brigade attend more road traffic collisions than they do fires.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think there's many companies that say, hang on, we're all going to go into the car park and let's imagine that there's been an incident. What should you and shouldn't you do to keep yourself safe, sort of thing. So, we know occasionally we see the odd pedestrian killed on a motorway and you're thinking, well, why are they there? And it's quite often because they've left a vehicle and things like that. So yeah, to me, there's quite a bit of work in this area about actually we should all be trained in this scenario that is actually quite likely to happen. If you have a punch or if something happens, do you stay in the car? Do you get out? What do you do? So I think sort of widening that out is a really important behaviour that we need to think about and get out there.
Absolutely. And I mean, certainly bad experience to date with a lot of things that we're involved in is people are very, very, very keen to help and to support and be to doing the right thing. All we're trying to do is give them better tools and more confidence that they're doing the right thing whilst keeping themselves safe.
Yes. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Right. So on to our first session. Can I just say, if you haven't spotted, on the website, there's a link to a PDF that has the agenda on and the bios of all the speakers. So I'm only going to say very sort of basic intros of who the speakers are, and there's a lot more detail on that PDF. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, then maybe open that in a separate window if you can. So our first session is on instruction and training. We've got two speakers. Actually, we've got three speakers, but two presentations. The first one's from Dr. Liz Box from the RAC Foundation. The second one is a joint one from Heidi Duffy, MBE, and Dr. Victoria Kroll. So if we can play the first video, please.
Okay, so Jamie, are you happy for me to share my slides?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
But yeah, video. I was a bit worried then.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Video
sorry.
ready.
We're going to video you and share it later.
Lovely. Okay, I'm about to cover up all my screen. So if there's anything you need to highlight my attention to, Jamie, do let me know as we go through. So hopefully you can see the slides on the screen.
Yep.
So good morning, everybody. And yeah, PACTS, thank you for inviting me to speak at the event today and kind of open, I think, with a bit of a general presentation on some things we should all be thinking about as we're designing good quality interventions to change behaviour in driver education. So my name is Elizabeth Box. I'm Research Director at the RAC Foundation, and a lot of my work focuses on how we can use behavioural science to design and evaluate road safety interventions, and hoping that they will genuinely shift behaviour in the real world. So today I'm going to be talking about some of those essential principles I think we should all be thinking about, and that draws on evidence from psychology, human factors, and evaluation studies as well. And I suppose hope and explore really how we can move beyond sort of well-intentioned messages to approaches that meaningfully reduce road risk. So I think there's always a debate about what is road safety education. So when we talk about road safety education, we're generally talking about any organised effort to influence how people think and behave on the roads, from children walking to school to pre-drivers and more experienced road users. I think all of us probably on this call invest a huge amount of time, creativity and funding into these different programmes. So whether they are, doing very high looking at crash scenes like you've got there on the screen, or motorway guidance, or humorous campaigns. So I think most of us here have essentially delivered something that looks a little bit like one of these examples. What we know is that traditional road safety education that sort of focuses on knowledge and fear and threat appeal essentially doesn't typically produce the safety benefits that we'd hope for. So many programs that we deliver unfortunately have a neutral effect at best, and some may distract actually from us doing more effective measures like licensing or system design change. So why is this the case? Well, first, education tends to focus on telling people things that they already know. So largely speaking, people know that speeding is risky. They know that seatbelts matter and they know that phones are distracting, but they still continue to do it anyway. So we know that information alone rarely changes what people actually do behind the wheel. And I've done a lot of work on young drivers, and we know that many young driver initiatives don't actually address the real factors behind collisions within this group, such as their inexperience and their age-related vulnerability, peer influence, and challenges that they might have with self-control and decision-making. So I would say if education is going to make a real meaningful difference going forward, it needs to be better timed, evidence-focused, and focused on the behaviours and situations that we know actually drive that collision risk for the different groups that we're focusing on. So why does behaviour change matter in this particular field? Well, because most crashes aren't actually caused by people not knowing the rules, they're actually caused by people not doing what they already know that they should be doing. So drivers can pass their theory tests with full marks and still speed. They can still check a message, or they can still take a chance at a junction. So as I've already said, simply giving them information or using fear to shock them tends to have quite a short-term effect. And internationally, it's really interesting. We often see road safety education discussed very lightly, almost as if it's optional, because we know that other parts of the safe system, like road and vehicle design, can be much more impactful. And actually, that's absolutely right that we should be focusing people on the system change. But just like enforcement, education, we know is still a very crucial supporting layer that we need to get right. So if we're going to deliver it, we need to do it in a way that we know actually supports positive behaviour. And I think this is where behavioural science really helps and guides us in this. So it gives us those structured, evidence-based tools that help us design education that sticks and genuinely complements the rest of the system. So obviously we can't have meetings without putting the safe system up there. So all the rest of the presenters the rest of the day can take this slide out of their presentations. But of course, I think to start, we have to say that the first principle here is really our grounding point. You know, we all know as professionals that safe system conception, we know it very well. There's no need for me to go into detail here, other than to say it's the foundation for understanding where road safety education fits. As we know, at its heart, the safe system starts with those two simple truths that people make mistakes and we're physically vulnerable when things do go wrong. And because of that, responsibility has to be shared across the whole system: roads, vehicle speeds, users, and post-crash care. So no single measure can carry the whole load. And that's what's really important for how we think about driver education. Education is one protective layer. It's very valuable, but it's never the only solution. And it can't create perfect error-free drivers. But what it can do is help build drivers who are more aware, more prepared, and more resilient within an environment that also protects them. So when we talk about behaviour change today, it's very much in that context. So our aim isn't to lecture people into perfection. Really, our aim is to help make safe road use the easy, normal and supported choice, aligns with what the system and the rest of the system is doing. So what does the evidence tell us about fear as a driver of behaviour? So this major meta-analysis, which came out last year, shows that while emotional appeals are common, their actual impact is actually quite small. So fear, worry, or perceived risk do increase attention largely to messaging, but the link to real behaviour is quite weak. And this particular study looked across all different areas of public health with some interesting examples. So for instance, studies looking at COVID-19 anxiety found that there was small effects on protective behaviours as a result. In terms of climate risk, there was a negligible link to adaptation. So when people thought there was a big issue there, it didn't really link to what they were doing in their own behaviours. And in terms of HIV risk, there was almost no link to condom usage in the studies that looked at that. So across the various different domains, we know that fear may sensitise people, but it does rarely lead to that meaningful action. So other emotions that we can sort of pull on, like pride, guilt, or gratitude, can have some stronger effects, but overall their effects remain quite small. So overall, the takeaway is that emotional appeals alone are not enough for sustained behaviour change. And we know that fear often fails because high threat messages, they trigger people's avoidance. Drivers, particularly those most at risk, such as young drivers, may reject or minimise the messages that are provided to them. If messages are too scary, people can also switch off, or if they are too neutral, they don't have any impact either. So we have to get the right sort of balance there. So obviously emotion does have its place, but it can't carry the intervention. And given that's what we focused on a lot in past interventions, it's important that we're aware of that. So if fear and threats aren't very effective, what should we be focusing on instead? So the review I've just been referring to makes the point that many of the things we instinctively reach for, so increasing knowledge, shifting beliefs, improving awareness, have very little impact on actual behaviour. But what really matters is helping people overcome the obstacles that stop them from acting safely. So if you look at the chart on the screen, you'll see that knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes are identified as weak levers, but emotions, reminders, incentives, and norms have been found to have a small effect. But what has much stronger drivers of behaviour is habits and social support, and access in particular. So making the safe behaviour the easiest behaviour is often the most powerful of all of the different levers that we've got. And I think that's a real crucial lesson for us in road safety. So instead of doubling down on very knowledge heavy or fear-based campaigns, we need to build habits, strengthen that social support, and remove barriers so that the safer choice is definitely the easier one for people to take. And the takeaway is that we need to focus on enabling that success, not warning about failure, especially because that heavy threat can backfire, especially for some of our most high-risk drivers. So how do we apply all this in practice? Well, one of the well-used models we have is the COMBI. I'm sure many of you are very aware of it, and it sits at the centre of the behaviour change wheel. COMBI tells us that for any behaviour to happen, 3 things have to be in place. So there needs to be the capability. So people need to have the right knowledge and skills. I've obviously talked about knowledge not being very effective, but obviously you do need to have a foundational knowledge there. And if there's a gap, then that definitely does need to be filled. But they don't just have to have that knowledge. They need to have the confidence and the skills to use them, or that particular basis. In terms of opportunity, we know that people need to have the right environment to support the behaviour, whether that's physical infrastructure, social norms, or just simple cues that make behaviour possible. And then motivation, that road users have to want to act either through their conscious decisions or through automatic processes like habits. So effective interventions essentially diagnose which of these elements is the weakest and then designs solutions to strengthen it. So I work a lot on the young driver field. So take young drivers using their phones. That's not just a knowledge issue, it's a habit issue, it's social pressure, it's a lack of easy alternatives. So COMBI helps us see that clearly. And this is where research becomes really essential, because without understanding our background understanding of the field, which component is missing, we end up designing essentially the wrong solutions. So again, I would say the goal isn't to tell people what to do, but to help create those conditions that make the safe behaviour the easy, normal and rewarding one. So behaviour change isn't something that happens in a single lesson or a single message. It's very much a process. And many of you will be familiar with the stages of change model that shows that people move through different phases, from not yet thinking about changing to considering changing potentially, to preparing, taking action, and then finally maintaining a behaviour or new habits. So in driver behaviour, this means that road users sit at a very different points on that journey. Some aren't ready, and it's not necessarily a linear process either, or some don't even see that there's a problem. Others are thinking maybe about change but don't know how to. Others might be already trying to do the right thing and just need support to get going. So essentially, effective driver education needs to meet these groups where they are. And for some, that means raising awareness. For others, it's building practical skills and plans. And for those that are already committed to safe driving, it's about helping them maintain those behaviours after particular events, like they might have a test or they might have experienced an offence as well. So key messages: we can't treat every driver as if they're at the same stage, and we need to tailor our approaches to their readiness to change as well. So once people know what the safe behaviour is, the real challenge is getting it to happen automatically, especially in moments of pressure or when people are distracted. So there's two tools I've thought it would be worthwhile mentioning here that have been found to be really effective in the research. So implementation intentions and habits. So implementation intentions are simple if-then plans to pre-program, if you like, a response. So there's an example on the screen here of if I get in the car, then I put my phone on do not disturb or set that automatically. Or if my friends want to speed, then I'll say I'll meet them there. So important to have the condition and then what they're going to do instead. So the idea here is that these plans remove the need for decision making in the moment. Alongside that, we want drivers to build habits and routines. So very small, consistent actions at the start of every journey: seatbelts, mirrors, phone away. Because when these become automatic, they no longer have to essentially rely on willpower. And this is where the concept of EAST from the Behavioural Insights team comes in, which really encourages making the desirable actions easy, attractive, social and timely. So when we help, and I'm thinking particularly of young drivers here, to create their own if-then plans and then practice them, we make that safer behaviour the path of least resistance that they can draw on in the moment. I would also say when we're designing interventions, logic models really matter in driver education, because they essentially stop us jumping straight from we've delivered something to we think it's worked. They force us to be really clear about what resources we're using, what we're actually doing with learners, and what changes we realistically expect to see as a result. So in the Drive Fit programme, which I've been trialling with funding from the Road Safety Trust, the logic model has really helped us to develop those very specific short-term changes to measure in the survey work that we're doing, like hazard confidence, safer attitudes to phones, fatigue, speeding, and improving confidence in terms of taking that forward. So the value of logic models is that it keeps everyone aligned on what success should look like and makes future evaluation more robust. So even a simple one-page version can help transform that real clarity and impact of the intervention you're hoping to have. And the last principle that I've thought was quite important to mention this morning was around co-design, testing and refining, because we should never really be designing in isolation. Essentially, co-design, as you all know, will mean involving people who actually use the intervention from the start. So it helps us really surface those blind spots that we have as practitioners. It challenges the assumptions we might have about what people will want and need, and ensures the content feels really relevant rather than being imposed by others. But it doesn't mean that we simply do what other people say. You know, lived experience isn't essential, it's important, but it has to work alongside the evidence, not instead of it. So the strongest interventions are always a bit of a balanced mix of user insight and scientific principles. So just finally, you know, what if we were looking at designing change that lasts? What would that look like? So I suppose if there's one thing I hope you take away from today, it's that road safety isn't about changing people, it's about changing the conditions around them. We've seen that knowledge alone rarely works and that fear can sometimes backfire as well. But we also see that when we design for capability, opportunity and motivation, we make it much easier for people to make the safer choice, make it more natural and more likely to stick. And that's where our power as practitioners really lies. So it's not in telling people what to do. It's about creating those environments and systems that have the messages that make safer behaviour the default behaviour. So thank you for listening. I hope that session has helped start the conference, spark some ideas and some things you can take back to your own work. And I'm looking forward to hearing the discussions that take place across the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's given us a really good sort of foundation to build on today. And there will be a bit of Q&A in about sort of 16, 17 minutes. So we'll get Liz back on then. So if we can play the next video.
Good morning, my name is Heidi Duffy and I'm the facilitator for the National Young Rider Forum. We focus exclusively on young riders who are novice riders aged between 16 to 24 years riding small bikes of 125cc or less. We've been working with Dr. Victoria Kroll from East Situ on a new project called A View from the Saddle, which was Road Safety Trust grant funded. What it aims to do is produce hazard perception and hazard prediction films viewed from the saddle of a young rider on a small bike in urban areas, rather than the traditional big bikes on rural roads. I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Kroll soon. We're trying to change driver and rider behaviour by giving them the tools to look at hazards, identify them, and then hopefully take the appropriate action to avoid being in collision. Thank you for PACTS for inviting National Rider Forum to the conference today.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Vicky Kroll and I'm CEO and co-founder of East Situ Solutions, a company dedicated to developing and validating driver assessment and training tools based on the science of hazard perception and driver risk. We're a spin-out from Nottingham Trent University, where much of the original research behind our tools began. Today we continue that research, often in collaboration with Nottingham Trent University, to help organisations in the fleet sector better understand, assess and reduce driver risk. Now, as Heidi says, today we're going to be talking about a project where we work together to develop a motorcycle-specific hazard test. Now, as most of you will be aware, the hazard perception test was introduced to the UK driver licensing procedure back in 2002. Since then, it's had a really positive effect on driver safety in the UK. One annual estimate estimates that we have around 8,500 fewer damage-only collisions and over 1,000 fewer injury collisions each year, with an annual saving of nearly £90 million to the UK economy. So it has been a real success. But the problem is that it is a car test. It was designed for car drivers and it doesn't necessarily reflect the types of hazards that motorcycle riders face. So for example, the test is shown from the perspective of a car driver looking straight ahead, and it doesn't have any mirrors, so you kind of feels a little bit like a disembodied experience because you haven't got any reference to what's going on behind you. It also doesn't measure exactly what you do in those situations, whether you'd slow down, whether you'd overtake, or whether perhaps you'd even take a risk. Now, despite how important hazard perception is, there is actually no test at all in compulsory basic training, or CBT as it's more colloquially known. And that is the test that anyone must do if they want to go and ride anything below a 125. And interestingly enough, those who actually progress beyond a CBT, they will take a DVSA hazard test. However, but it is the car-based test that they will be taking. And yes, that is a bit of a problem because while motorcycles, they make up 1% of traffic, they actually make around 20% of all fatal collisions on the UK roads. So it's really important that we can do something to address the safety of motorcycle riders. We know that hazard perception works, it's proven, it's valuable, it's saved lives and money, but it's not designed for motorcycle riders. So what is the solution? Well, the solution is obviously to develop a motorcycle-specific hazard test. But has anyone actually tried to do this before? Well, if we take a look at the literature, there has been a number of attempts. So, for example, in 2013, TRL developed a motorcycle-specific test, and to validate the test, i.e. to identify whether the test can tap into the skill of hazard perception, they asked experienced and novice riders to watch matched video clips. So sometimes it contained a hazard and sometimes it didn't contain a hazard. And they asked the rider to indicate their preferred riding speed. They also created a training intervention that involved group discussion and rider commentary. What they found was that the test successfully discriminated between the experienced and the novice riders, so that's great. It's suggesting that that test is a valid test that taps into the skill of hazard perception. And importantly, they also demonstrated that the training also led to a greater reduction in speed choice. However, this was only found for the novice riders. In a similar vein, Professor David Krundle in 2012 also created a motorcycle-specific test. However, both of these previous attempts used footage that was filmed from the front of the vehicle, didn't actually contain any mirror information. So there was no measure of being able to look at the hazards that potentially came from behind the rider and the bike. In 2016, a company called Osroads created a CGI test that did actually contain mirror information. However, this was in 2016 and we haven't yet heard anything about this since. So what did we decide to do? Obviously, we decided to create our own. So to create our own test, we were fortunate enough to partner up with the National Young Rider Forum and apply for a Road Safety Trust grant. Luckily, we were successful with the grant, and the grant was awarded as a 15-month project to design and evaluate a motorcycle-specific hazard test. So how would we go about doing and creating such a test? Well, first of all, we want to do some pilot footage. So luckily we had some kind riders who gave up their time to assist with this particular filming. Special thank you to Charles. And we wanted to trial 3 particular viewpoints. So the first one was head mounted. So as you can see from the image on the left on the screen, basically we stuck a camera to the helmet of the rider, and we thought that this would perhaps offer the closest match to the rider's perspective in terms of height and positioning, and it could increase the realism and immersion. However, we did note when we saw the footage, this perhaps was the least stable of all of the images and all of the footage. Our next one was looking at the drone follow style. So basically we gave the rider a backpack and it had like a special harness that a selfie stick attached to, and the camera went onto the back of that, and it gave that sort of like game player positioning, so you were sort of sat behind the rider, as you can see in the picture. It looks fantastic. However, it was possible that the body and the head of the rider kind of obscured some of the details straight in front of the bike. Also, it made feeling that potential hazards did feel like they were a bit further away, a bit more difficult to see. So our final positioning was basically sticking the camera on the front of the bike, and this gave a very stable and consistent frame when we looked at the footage. Now, to decide which of these viewpoints we were going to use for the actual filming, we took it to a focus group. So this was the first of 2 focus groups, and the overall recommendation from that focus group was actually to proceed with the bike-mounted camera position. So luckily, the riders that took part in the pilot filming, they were also willing to give up a couple of weeks or several weeks of their time to go out and film around Nottinghamshire for us. We were also very lucky that a local bike provider offered to lend us 125 bikes for the filming to borrow for the time period. Now, we wanted to use 125 bikes because we really wanted the footage to be relevant for our gig economy riders. So we didn't think it would look as relevant if they were on massive big bikes, because obviously you would be able to see from the speeds that it wasn't a 125 bike. So to keep that kind of realism, we borrowed 125 bikes, and we had lots of riders give up their time, which was really very grateful of them. Once we'd been out and done all of the filming, our first stage was an internal review by our company. We went and looked through all of the footage and selected footage and scenarios that were of prominent interest. Now, what we did then, obviously we had a second focus group, as I mentioned before. We couldn't take everything that we'd seen from the footage to the focus group, or we would have been there forever. So we picked the most prominent stimuli from all of that and held a focus group with motorcycle safety experts, members of DVSA, police, and National Young Rider Forum as well. And we went through all of these clips to really pick out the ones that we wanted to use as the final clips. Now, when we were going through them in our internal review, what we wanted to pick clips where they had a traditional hazard perception response, but the clip also ended with something else, so that we could add in a question at the end. And I'll talk through that in a little bit more. But essentially we ended up with 18 different clips, and 20 of those included a priori hazard. So 2 of the clips contained 2 hazards. So what we did was we put the scoring windows around the hazards, and these were split into 5 subsections. So a button response within the first subsection would score 5 points, with later subsections decreasing in points awarded until the window closed. Now, we set them ourselves. However, when we did the focus group, we reviewed these and amended these based on the feedback from the focus group and all of the experts within there. Here's a little example of what the clip actually looked like. So as you can see, we also included mirror information. So we did this by, when we were doing the filming, popping a camera on the back and superimposing that into the graphic overlay to provide the mirror information. So we can really capture those hazards that come from behind whilst motorcycling. So as you can see here, the hazard was that car pulling out of there. I don't actually believe this is one of the ones that we used in the final one, but it's an example of the footage. This clip is being used, I believe, for other things, for example, the kind of marketing side of the test. So we have 18 clips and 20 of those contain hazards. However, 10 of those actually also ended at a point where an additional hazard had started to develop. So what we wanted to do was also add into that clip a measure of what we call hazard prediction. So essentially the clip will end just as that hazard's about to onset, and the participant will get asked what happens next. And then they'll be shown 4 options on the screen, a bit like you can see on the screen here, and they have to pick one of the options, which is what actually happened next. Now, your safe and your more experienced riders, if they've been looking at the right place at the right time when the screen was cut, then they will know what the correct answer is. So with the focus group, what we did was we asked them to review how much of that hazardous precursor, so how much of the hazard they saw before the screen was cut. We amended what we'd got based on their input for that. We also asked them to advise on the appropriateness of the other options on the screen. Obviously, one is the correct answer, but the wording of the correct answer and also the wording of the other answers, the distractor answers as we call them. We wouldn't want the distractor answers to be so silly that it's obviously not the answer. We don't want to give them the answer. We want to disguise the answer because we know that our safe and our experienced riders, they're going to know the answer because they would have seen it in that hazardous precursor. So the remaining 8 of the 18 clips actually occluded where the rider had to make a critical decision. So following the occlusion, they were asked a question like, what would you do next? And followed by 4 options to choose from. So half of the clips, they're actually given pictorial multiple choice options, a bit like what's shown on screen, just because it was easier than trying to explain, particularly if it was to do with road positioning, actually showing a top-down view. It's a lot easier than trying to explain where they should be positioning. So there was questions about filtering, there's questions about amber lights as well. So this is really tapping into that, what would they do, how would they respond in that particular situation. So to evaluate it, we actually tested online. So we recruited 124 riders via an online participant panel, which allowed us to send out the test digitally, and they completed it via our own learning management system, which allowed them to complete the test and get their score at the end. So in order to establish whether the observed hazard scores could be predicted by motorcycle riding experience, now we measured this as the total number of collisions in the last 3 years, years since riding, and total collision history, we carried out what we call a number of linear regressions to predict the 3 assessment measures. So that is hazard prediction, hazard perception, and what we call hazard avoidance. Within the model, we also included age and gender. For the hazard perception model, we also included the number of responses as a predictor. So that's the number of times they pressed. And we did this because previous research has shown a strong correlation between the number of hazard response presses and hazard perception score. So what did we find? Well, we found that only for hazard perception, crashes in the last 3 years predicted hazard perception score. So those with more crashes in the last 3 years performed worse on the test, suggesting that the test is sensitive to the skill of hazard perception. So it's a valid measure of hazard perception. It validates our primary measure within the test, showing that riders' scores on this measure are predicted by the number of collisions they report within the last 3 years. Now, interestingly, the number of pressers also predicted their hazard perception score. And this relationship remained even after removing the most frequent responders as outliers. Now, one possibility is that participants simply adopted a conscious strategy of basically clicking more to increase their chances of landing within a response window and scoring more points. However, it's also possible that those participants were just genuinely better at hazard perception and perceived more hazards and therefore responded more often. So distinguishing between these possibilities is a really important area of research for future work that hopefully we'll be able to get to look at. Now, interestingly, we didn't actually find any relationship between rider experience, any of the measures of crash history, and hazard prediction or hazard avoidance. So let's take a little think about why that might be the case. Well, if we look at hazard prediction, our average score was actually 72%. This is probably higher than what we found in our previous research, and actually what it might suggest is that these particular clips, they were too easy. Remember, I spoke about the cut points. Potentially they just got too long to see the hazard. So in our next iteration, it might make sense to make the bit of hazard that they are able to see a little bit shorter. In terms of the hazard avoidance, well, this may actually be related to the fact that the answers are quite subjective. So what one person might think is the correct answer, someone else might not think, because it's not a definite answer with that particular one. Now, this also begs the question, should we remove the hazard prediction element and the hazard avoidance element as part of the whole test? Well, probably not, because actually if we do that, we might unintentionally alter how drivers engage with the task and therefore weaken the relationship between hazard perception score and crash risk. So for now, I think it's best we just keep the test as it is. So in terms of conclusions, the project developed and validated a motorcycle-specific test. Hazard perception was the only measure of hazard perception that linked to crash history, validating as a measure of real-world safety skill. Since the project has been completed, we have actually put a touchscreen kiosk in the National Motorcycle Museum to allow young riders to engage with it whenever they go there. They have got the full version of the test, but the full version of the test does take about 10 minutes. So there is a shortened version of the test on there for them to go and have a go. We are also exploring the use of it in the gig economy. And really exciting for us is the test is being used with one of the largest training providers in the country as being sent out as pre-learning for CBT and motorcycle license. Obviously, it can't be included as a mandatory part. It is a voluntary part of it, but it's really there to help improve the safety of the riders should they want to help do that for themselves. And we have, since project completion, been successful in some additional Innovate UK funding to develop a virtual reality version of the test, which is really exciting, and that project is underway at the moment. And as part of that project, we are actually filming, or have done some filming, in London as well. So we're going to be getting some really, really exciting content for that particular one. Look forward to updating further on that one. But please feel free to email me any questions. I really appreciate everyone listening into this talk. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. So if I can welcome our speakers to join me, and we can open up some questions from the audience. I just sort of want to pick up on the last presentation. I was talking to an MP recently, and one of her constituents had failed his theory tests several times, and eventually decided to not bother trying and get on a bike where he didn't have to take the tests, and unfortunately was then killed sort of shortly afterwards. I'm not saying it's related, but it does seem to be that, you know, we should have a, you know, if someone's going to drive on the road, it shouldn't matter how they're doing it. And I was just thinking, you know, actually the bike tests kids do, actually hazard perception could be an interesting sort of part of that. So yeah. So do I have Heidi and Dr. Victoria? Are you on there as well? So I can't see you on my screen.
I'm here, Jamie.
I'm here as well.
Excellent. I've got a quick question before I look to the audience. Most drivers think they're better than average, yeah? So how do we reach them? If they already think they're better, how do we change their behaviours? But if that's more one for Liz or yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure the others will have views on that as well. I mean, it always comes down to humans have optimism bias. We all think that we're going to be okay, and that's partly the problem that we've had in presenting risks to people, particularly in a way that they don't recognise as them, or they don't see as part of their friends, and therefore they dismiss messages. So I think that's really why the evidence supports an approach that much more focuses on, we can all think about improvements, can't we, that we can make to our own skills and our own knowledges and abilities, and that's a lot easier way to go at it with people in a way that they might recognise. So thinking about the things and planning and what you might do is a very much more practical route in, rather than trying to convince somebody that they are going to. I mean, thankfully we know that road traffic collisions are still a relatively rare event. People will obviously know of people that have been in traffic collisions or they've had minor events, but they still know their day-to-day experience is they get away with quite a lot of what we would consider bad activity in terms of speeding, taking something a bit too tight and getting away with it. So they won't necessarily have a collision, they won't necessarily be caught, and therefore everybody's everyday experiences, well, actually I'm pretty skilled and I'm okay. So how do we counter that? As I said, I think it needs to come back to the behavioural science that I was talking about, in terms of making those action plans and engaging with it in a way that people can see themselves in, essentially.
Heidi, Victoria, got anything you want to add to that, or shall I move on to the next question?
Obviously, we're looking at riders, and for us, the most vulnerable of our young riders are those 16 to 18 year olds who are very inexperienced out on the road. So we see it as our mission to put as much education and support into that young 16 to 18 year old group, because they're the ones that are overrepresented obviously in the KSIs, and hazard perception and the work we've been doing with Dr. Kroll is fundamentally one of the better ways of trying to give them the knowledge and hazard identification that could save their lives out on the network.
Okay. I've got a question here that's in sort of two parts. So the first part is there any evidence that shows that those that ride sort of powered two wheels are better car drivers? And the second part is, should we make everyone learn to drive a powered two-wheeler first before we let them into a car?
Brilliant. So I don't mind taking that one. So it dropped out a little bit. Was the question that is there any evidence that those who drive a bike are better car drivers? Was that the first?
That's the first part, yeah.
Yeah, but I believe that there is some academic evidence that does suggest, when doing a hazard perception test, that those who are dual, both car and motorcycle, have got better hazard perception skills. But again, there's also conflicting evidence on that as well. So that one I think needs a little bit more research in the side of it. But in terms of, should everyone be learning, who learns to drive a car, also do a two-wheel? I mean, I'm not entirely sure on the answer on that one, but I think it's obviously beneficial, to do, like Liz says in the questions, that exchanging places type thing, and not just necessarily with riding a bike. We know from just looking at the hazard clips that we've seen today that depending on the vehicle that you are, riding or driving, the hazards that you encounter are very, very different. If you're riding a bike, got a lot of things coming from a different angles, people pulling out on you. As we know from the evidence, car drivers don't always spot motorcyclists. But equally, it's not just motorcyclists. We could put people in a HGV and let them have a look at the type of hazards that HGVs encounter, and I think that would change their behaviours and the way that they respond and drive around HGVs. We know HGVs have got a longer stopping distance, and often cars pull in front of that distance that the driver leaves. By showing them the perspective of the HGV driver, we can actually make the driver think, well, actually I shouldn't be pulling into that gap, I should be giving a bit more space. And it's the same with the motorcyclist, allowing them to experience
how it feels and how it looks to ride a motorcycle, and then getting them back in the car, it can only be a benefit, because you're letting them see how it feels from everyone else's perspective. So yeah, I think there's a lot of benefit in it. How we could do it practically, I'm not entirely sure. If we could make it part of the DVSA test, everyone has to experience a different vehicle. But one way you could potentially do that is to let them watch a hazard perception test filmed from every type of vehicle that is possibly on the road. So I think there can only be benefit in that.
Sorted. And do we know what the barriers are to introducing this sort of nationally? Why hasn't it happened? Why aren't we doing this already?
In terms of motorcycle hazard perception?
Yes.
Yeah. In terms, I think, for the barriers, I know with obviously CBT, you don't have to do a hazard perception test as part of CBT, but if you do obviously progress beyond CBT to do your full motorcycle license, you do have to do a hazard perception test, albeit that test is actually filmed from a car, so it's not motorcycle specific. So it would be fantastic if we could get that to be motorcycle specific. However, in terms of the CBT, I think it's just getting that made as part of the test. At the moment, it isn't made as part of the test. We're working with a training provider that provides CBT at the moment, and they are getting allowing their riders to do our hazard test as part of pre-learning. Obviously, we can't make it mandatory part of the CBT because that is, mandated by the DVSA, but it's an additional thing that they're providing as pre-learning for their particular riders. I think that's a step forward with this. I think if we can show the benefit of it for riders, it could hopefully get taken up and be put in place for CBT as well.
And we are working with the DVSA and obviously very closely. And part of this project and other projects the National Young Rider Forum is doing is to look at providing evidence about pre-test online learning. We promote Ride Free, which is the DVSA National Highways package, which does include hazard perception, highway code, PPE, etc. But yes, we would really like to see a theory test for the CBT, but we're working very closely with the DVSA and hope that is something we can achieve going forward.
Yeah, because it does seem strange that the youngest and most inexperienced have the sort of, in a sense, the easiest route through to get onto the road.
I think there's a reason for it. I think the syllabus for CBT is actually laid down in statute, in law, and so changing it obviously is anything to do with changing laws is never very quick, as we know at the moment. But yes, certainly if we can provide the evidence, then hopefully we could do some sort of bolt-on or mandatory CBT theory test that they would take ahead of the actual CBT, and that would hopefully provide them with more knowledge.
I know this has generated a lot of sort of debate about gig economy and things like that as well. So I think it's been a very, very useful first session. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to move into the next session.